Victoria's government is in the midst of a major shake-up after 4 key ministers resigned yesterday. Transport Minister Jacinta Allen is tipped to take on the role of outgoing Deputy Premier James Merlino. Joining me live is politics lecturer at Monash University, Dr. Zareh Ghazarian. Zareh, how are you? This is a big day, isn't it, for this government?
A big day, of course it is. There are some significant outs for this government, and we've got to remember, of course, the government in Victoria was first elected in 2014, so the Andrews government is actually going for its 3rd consecutive term this year when the election is due in 2022. So we'd expect some ministers to be going by now, and it's very interesting that they all went on the same day, which was yesterday.
Is it an indictment on the leader? Is it an indictment on Dan Andrews and the confidence that people around him have in him?
Well, it's hard to see how the Labor Party is working at the moment because they're in such a very strong position in Victoria. The cracks really haven't appeared. And as I just mentioned, it is now starting to be a fairly older government, now in its 8th year. But really the cohesion has been very strong. And part of that, I suspect, is because the Labor Party is in such a strong position in Victoria. At the last election, it won 55 out of the 88 seats. And the coalition has a lot of ground to make up. So when times are good, political parties tend to demonstrate good cohesion.
It's hard to think that the Liberal Party, even with things like this, will turn it around quick enough by the end of the year.
They're coming from a very low base, having only won 27 of those 88 seats in the lower house. The coalition must have a huge turnaround in Victoria, and at the moment just don't get a sense that that is occurring. And looking at some opinion polls that have been published over the last year, they don't really show that the community has suddenly got a new appetite for a new government. So at the moment, it looks as though Labor's in a very comfortable position, but as we've seen, of course, there is a great deal of volatility in the electorate in Australia, and there's no guarantee that Labor will continue to be enjoying this position come November.
Dan Andrews is quite a polarising figure, but a lot of that comes from outside the borders of Victoria. Inside Victoria, he's still quite popular.
Absolutely, he's very popular. And in fact, he was enjoying great popularity even in the midst of the pandemic and with lockdowns being announced. Premier Andrews was certainly really, really popular. So I think that in itself speaks to the political culture and the political situation in Victoria at the moment, where the government really doesn't seem to be faltering, it doesn't seem to be shedding support. The only sort of warning signs we've seen was at the national level, where some electorates in outer metropolitan areas demonstrated their capacity and their willingness, essentially, to vote for non-major party candidates. But even that it's a bit hard to sort of link that development to state politics. So really, for observers in Victoria, it looks as though the coalition is in for a tough time, and this is Labor's election to lose.
What sort of role do you think independents will play at state level?
Well, we've seen at the national level a willingness of voters to embrace new independents and new minor parties. And that, if it was to occur in Victoria, may make the situation much trickier for any government, in particular if they were to hold the balance of power in the House of Representatives. Now, at the moment, I don't have any data to say that it's going to happen or any sort of suggestion that's going to happen, but we can see that there is an appetite in the community, and the major parties have struggled and they have gone backwards in some areas. So voters are looking at their options, and there is absolutely no guarantee that what we saw in 2018 in terms of party support will translate in 2022.
Now, the pandemic, look, we're still with the pandemic. It's still in our community in some form. Obviously, nothing like it has been in the past couple of years. But what did you lecture in this subject, what did you make of the politics of the pandemic? Because it was quite extraordinary to watch the way the whole of Australia and the states and the way they handled the politics of the pandemic.
Yeah, it was really interesting, wasn't it, where we saw the sometimes tension between elected officials and those unelected officials providing policy and health advice. Strategically, the government's made some really tough calls, as we know. And what we saw, of course, during the pandemic was that those governments were rewarded by the public. We had elections in Queensland, we had elections in Tasmania, and then, of course, in WA. And in each of those cases, the government was returned. So it appeared that the community was generally supportive of what governments had done. The Victorian case is going to be interesting, of course, because it's not in the midst of those lockdowns. And it's going to be interesting to see whether there is any resentment towards the Andrews government for those lockdowns, or whether that goodwill continues to remain.
Yeah, because the health system is crippled, isn't it? In Victoria, the health system has a lot of challenges.
I think that's one of the challenges for the system, obviously in terms of health, in terms of funding, in terms of education, service delivery. These are going to be the things that the government or both parties will be really strongly campaigning on. And that's probably the best opportunity at the moment for the coalition to start attacking and to strengthen their attacks on the Andrews government in terms of service delivery, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's police, all those traditional things. I would expect that's where the most vigorous campaigning is going to be.
Great to have your insights on the program this morning. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks so much for having me.